All right, we're gonna begin the best MHE research presentations. Welcome to family and faculty and guests. We are really excited to present our research for you today. Just a little rundown of what you're going to hear today. In this session, you'll hear three presentations. First, Meg Serrano will present, then I will present, Rachel Firstman, and then Jen Lay will finish us off. Each presentation will be about 10 minutes long, and then we'll have 5 minutes for questions. So please save your questions to that 5-minute period so that we stay on time. Also, make sure your cell phones are off. We have a camera in the back that is videotaping, so you will have access to that video, so you don't have to have your phone up videotaping the entire time. And please stay in this room for the entirety of the session. We don't want to interrupt the flow of these presentations or anyone else's presentations, so just stay put until you pick your next presentation to go to for the next session. So we will begin with Meg Serrano's presentation.
Well, hello and welcome. I'm Meg, and I am completing my MIT in secondary biology, and I'm going to be sharing with you my search for a more authentic form of assessment. I should also explain this Far Side cartoon. It's a bit of my thing. At the beginning of every unit that I taught, I always had a few relevant ones, and today I'm the Stegosaurus at the podium. The Stegosaurus is also discussing evolution and ecology, which are the two topics I taught during this research. So this is when I realized there was a problem with test anxiety in my class. This is an excerpt from my teacher journal, and you're going to see a lot of letters. Those are just the students. I'm abbreviating their names. But these students had exhibited knowledge during classwork and labs. It seemed like they were getting it, and then come the test day, they just blanked. Alice was really upset and frustrated, just repeating, I don't know any of this, I don't know any of this. And Ella was in a similar situation, but for her I was able to rephrase the question in a way that got her thinking. But it was really upsetting. And so after plugging in some dismal test grades, test after test, I realized I needed to address this somehow. And so I wanted to find a more authentic form of assessment, a summative assessment at the end of a unit, that could more authentically reflect their true understanding of that topic. But I couldn't get so alternative that they're unprepared for the state exam, the MCAS in June. So I wanted to find a form that I could also use to prepare them for that exam. So some context, my teaching placement was in Framingham High School, and I taught 2 classes there, an ACP, which is the average level, and CP, which is considered lower level. And that's relevant here, so 8 of my 10 students were on IEPs, which is an individualized education plan. And they've been in this lower level track for some time, so as a result, they've developed a sort of handicapped mindset. They've been told either explicitly or implicitly that they're not capable of certain things, and they've really integrated that into their self-concept, so you can really see that come out in their test anxiety. Another thing I couldn't really address was the fact that this was B period, often first period of the day, so if you're tired or hungry or still asleep at home, you're not going to do well on the test. So in order to figure out what form of assessment I wanted to use, I wanted to ask the student who needed it the most. Z was an interesting student. She was so full of potential, but she often checked out in class, which I was able, once I developed a relationship with her, that improved. But she consistently scored like 40s on her test. So she really needed some other way to show what she understood. And she wanted to do trivia. She doesn't like Kahoot, which is like an online quiz game where students can answer on their phone, because you get points based on how quickly you answer, and everyone else can see how you're doing. So I understand why they don't like that. So I wanted to go in the direction of pub trivia, because they wouldn't lose points like you would in Jeopardy, and I could collect an answer sheet at the end. So the data I'm going to be referring to comes from their trivia and their unit test that followed it. Since I was kind of experimenting with this, I didn't want to replace unit test entirely, so we sort of used it like a review, and it counted for a class grade. I also interviewed the students about their feelings about tests. I kept a teacher journal about the good and the bad days. I had feedback from my inquiry community of 4 other MAT students, and I did a resource review of other research into authentic assessment. So the first one occurred at the end of the evolution unit. Part of these questions are MCAS questions, and part of them are just basic ones I wrote to test their understanding of different terms. So this is an example of just a basic question. Can they read the graph and apply the appropriate term? The answer is B, by the way. This is a bulky MCAS question. Compressed on a test page, this could overwhelm anyone, and it could cause students like S to just shut down. So I wanted to make this friendlier through a visual aid, through color coding some of the words, bolding other keywords, show that you can access this material. And here's how they did. So first, I do want to acknowledge that yes, there are students missing their trivia data. And that's because they had crumpled up their answer sheets and thrown them away before I could collect them. They didn't think it mattered. So, low stakes, I guess. But you can also see that those who I did have either did just as well in the trivia or even better. Elle is a great example. She got a 53 on her test, but a 73 on her trivia. An interesting thing that I observed during that time, and during a similar activity that following Friday, is that S did her version of eeny, meeny, miny, mo while she was thinking, and I did it with her in my head, and if you did that every time, you would always land on C. But she didn't always give me C. She often gave me the right answer. And so it seemed to me that it was her scapegoat. If she were wrong, she can just laugh it off. And if she was often surprised that she was right, it would suggest to me that she doesn't give herself credit for what she really knows. So 1 unit later, we're at a college trivia. All of these questions are MCAS questions, and I really wanted to focus on bolding the key points and focusing on the question within the big wording question. So MCAS likes to give you a lot of extraneous information, but you don't really need to know that we're talking about tube worms. You just need to know about the relationships. But students, if they solve this question without the bolding, they would just see a big question and just decide to pick the longest answer, which would be competition, which is incorrect. So here they can focus on what really matters to answer the question. Another one, if they know this content, they should be able to look at the bold words and pretty quickly be able to answer the question. Otherwise, there's a lot of repeating of the same words, and it can get kind of confusing. So here's how they did. And you can see that many students showed significant improvement with trivia. There's some students who did pretty poorly on their tests, but they got well above 75% on their trivia. Notice that I'm comparing this only to the multiple choice in their test, because I realize at this point that is more directly comparable to the format of the trivia. So I also wanted to think about how students are doing on the multiple choice and the short answer. And you can see that some students do better at one than the other. So not understanding the content aside, if students are doing poorly on the multiple choice, that suggests that they're just answering randomly or choosing the longest answer. And if they're doing poorly on the short answer, that suggests that they either don't express themselves well in writing or they've burned out at this point, because these questions are often at the end of the test. So given all of this, the students can fall into certain categories. There's always going to be students who do well with whatever you throw at them, like D and A. And there's always going to be students who are going to need a more individualized approach, like P. But most of the students showed some improvement with trivia. And notice that most of them are the same ones that struggle with multiple choice. And what's interesting about this is the same kinds of questions, it's just in a different format. And that made all the difference to them. So when I interviewed students about their feelings about tests, I heard from many of them that it becomes immediately overwhelming when you see all these pages covered in all these words, and that gives you a bad taste in your mouth from the beginning. And Elle articulated very well that she feels isolated and helpless at test day because during class she has me and her classmates and her notes, and at a test it's just her and her brain, and it doesn't feel like enough to her. And many of them talked about, in response to that feeling, having resource sheets in math class helps because they can write down equations they want to remember, and it's something to refer to. So that's something I might experiment with one day. And interestingly, the same students who struggle to stay focused are the same ones who struggle with the short answer question. So what have I learned through all of this? It does seem like trivia works for some students, but as a scientist, I definitely need more data. I messed up by not collecting some of the trivia things, and it's also a small sample size. So there could be a lot of individual variation. Maybe you're having a good day during ecology and a bad day during evolution, and I only have these two things from you. So I would like to try this over the whole school year, and maybe even at some point give students the option, take a test or take trivia, and the answer sheet for trivia would be the paper test, so you're still exposed to the same questions, and you're answering the same questions as everyone else. And I'm also thinking about how can they transfer the skills that they're exhibiting in trivia to a different test. Maybe a cover sheet could help them focus on one question at a time. maybe highlighters could help them focus on key terms and not get bogged down by the whole question. And I also don't want to forget about other valuable forms of summative assessment. I love lab practicals because students can actively demonstrate what they know by doing a thing. And I like projects, and I think that both of these things need to be integrated at the beginning of a class so that students are familiar with the expectations and the work that's involved in these things. But that's it, and I would love to entertain any questions or new things you have about this.
I think that by doing trivia, there's a sense that it's not really like a test, it's more like a game. And that's the first question, and the second question is, but eventually they're going to have to make that transition to really doing tests, I mean, for college and other settings. So how does that transition take place? Is it just because they get the skills through trivia that they can apply to tests?
So regarding the first question about it feeling like a game, I think that's definitely the case. That's why I try to want to make it look like a game show. So you don't get that stress of, here's a big important paper thing on your desk. But it's the same questions, and they can think about one question at a time. I think is really important for them. They don't have to see all of them at once. But in terms of transitioning, I think what I would definitely like to try is using the same paper test as your answer sheet. So you're seeing the same questions, including the short answer questions up there. And then they still have to deal with the fact that here's a paper test they need to write their answers on. So it kind of like weans them onto a paper test. And then eventually we can have like explicit discussions about seeing how well you did. It's the same thing. So you're capable of these things. It's a matter of like boosting their confidence because they've really gotten kind of trodden down at this point.
These activities help. Well, some of the pros were. It was a great way to let students.
So when you go with the words for students or the key phrases, did you go through with them why you were bolding those words so that they could like start to learn that process too?
I did, yeah. So I wanted to show them like, you don't need this stuff. Focus on this right here.
Get worried about whether you